so pleased to be with you all today to share about one of the coolest projects I've had an opportunity to work on in my faculty career. So as Erin said, I'm Lindsay Hastings. I'm on the leadership faculty at the University of Nebraska. I have an extension appointment as part of my faculty role. And so we engaged in this Leadership Chautauqua event last year that was essentially a think tank event on community leadership development. So I'm really excited to share this with you. I don't believe in long speeches. So I'll present for about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, and then I would love to open the floor for dialogue. I fully acknowledge that sometimes in a larger group, unmuting and speaking in that way can be sometimes intimidating. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. And I'd love to spend the majority of our time together in dialogue. I will also say too, I'm at my home office today because I have to take a kid to the doctor later, and the wind is blowing like 40 miles an hour here, and my rural internet is sometimes not amazing. So if I freeze or if something happens, I do have I've got a hotspot as well as my regular internet, so I may have to toggle if my internet runs into trouble. So, but anyway, hopefully we will be all good from a technology perspective. Okay, I'll share my screen here. Okay. So, like I said, this was by far this event, this Leadership Chautauqua event, was by far one of the coolest things I've ever worked on in my faculty career. So, to give you a little bit of background on what led to this event, we were seeing some trends and whatnot in community leadership development where we really felt like we needed to study community leadership from more of a structural perspective than looking at it from an individual leader perspective. So we conducted this pilot study looking at what are some of the structural elements associated within a community leadership structure that tend to be associated with momentum shifts in community change over time. The results of that study gave us some indicators around some of the sort of structural elements of a community leadership's fabric that tend to be associated with momentum shifts in community change over time. And so we wanted to then take those research results, really get broad perspective from community leaders, community development professionals around Nebraska to clarify some of these structural elements, but to also make visible maybe the invisible factors that are weighing in on those community leadership structures, which led to this Leadership Chautauqua. We were able to secure a grant from NCR-CRD to put on this Leadership Chautauqua event. We brought together over 100 community leaders and community development professionals from across the state of Nebraska to again have this very raw think tank event on community leadership development. Okay, so again, if you're asking what's a Chautauqua, I totally understand that. So when we're referring to a Chautauqua, it actually refers to, oops, sorry, went too far. Okay. It was actually the name of a site on a lake in upstate New York. So the Chautauqua was the first, the name of Chautauqua was actually an Iroquois word for this lake near the first Chautauqua site in 1874 with the idea that it was really meant to bring together diverse perspectives for dialogue and debate. And so we wanted to take that, we were inspired by that idea to create this Leadership Chautauqua, again, with the thought that we would build this think tank event around community leadership development to really hear from community leaders and community development professionals on this. So we could think about community leadership from more of a structural perspective. We had a big team working on this, which again was such a blast. So we were able to bring together faculty from the University of Nebraska. We were able to bring together community partners. My slides keep wanting to advance. Okay. We were able to bring together extension educators dedicated to rural development work. We were able to bring together community partners with Nebraska Community Foundation and the Heartland Center. We brought together grad students to do some real-time analysis while the event was going on. It was such a joy to bring together such a great group to support this event. Okay, so what were some of the things that we were paying attention to, which led to the pilot study, which then led to the Leadership Chautauqua? So what we were noticing some mega trends. One in particular, that the United States is poised to experience its largest wealth transfer in its history. So between now and 2060, the US is predicted to transfer $75 trillion from older generations to younger generations. And in Nebraska, the Nebraska Community Foundation was telling us that several counties in Nebraska are currently in their peak wealth transfer period. So that was one mega trend that we were noticing that was also having local impact. The other mega trend that we were noticing nationally that was having local impact, we were learning from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics that currently over half, so 54% of all management occupations are being held by individuals age 45 and older. So not only are we predicted to transfer 75 trillion, but also predicted to transfer over half of all of our management occupations. And we were realizing that for rural communities, they were likely going to be disproportionately affected by this, right? We had my good buddy Randy Cantrell, who worked in Nebraska Extension in the Ag Econ department for a long time. They did a little study showing that essentially for every person in a rural community, there are 3 leadership roles, right? So we knew that this leadership transfer was going to disproportionately affect rural areas. So that's really what led to the pilot study, trying to understand community leadership from more of a structural perspective, understand what are the dimensions of a community leadership fabric that create momentum shifts in community change over time, and then clarify those research results utilizing this Leadership Chautauqua concept. Okay, the other thing that we were noticing, it was that decades of research on community leadership development were at best documenting only individual level effects. Some of the best work on this was done from Kenneth Pig out of University of Missouri. He did some of the best work out there looking at community leadership development work across, I think, 6 different states. And when they tried to model the effect of the community leadership development programs, they were showing individual level effects, right? So like gains in self-awareness, gains in interpersonal skills, right? They were showing gains at that level. But then when he tried to model those individual level effects out to community level effects, right? Community level impact, the models kept falling apart. And that research result was repeated in several other studies as well, where essentially all we have been able to show from decades of research on community leadership development has really only been at the individual level. But ultimately, we want community leadership development efforts to have impact at the community level. So we're not quite getting the effects where we want to see them. Why is that? It's likely when we do the community leadership development program, right? So think about we gather 12 emerging community leaders. We do the once a month program where they maybe take the Strengths Finder and we have them tour a local business, right? So think that kind of model in your head. So why is it that we're only demonstrating individual level effects? Well, one reason for that might be, when we are evaluating a program right at the end, it's likely that the immediate effects of that program are only going to be at the individual level anyway. It's likely too that, too much time lapses between individual changes and then, modeling that all the way out to community level change. And there are also a lot of confounding factors that influence community change, right? So the impact of one community leadership development program, that influence might get choked out by a lot of other confounding factors that would be responsible for community change. And also, anytime we're working with humans, predicting what humans will do is really hard. So sometimes our measures or psychometric measurement, it can sometimes be less valid. Just trying to measure humans is harder. But why else? So the other thing, being a leadership scholar, the other thing that the leadership development field has been seeing is that, historically, leader and leadership development efforts have involved way too much reliance on individual leader development, doing event-driven programs, right? The once a month thing or the 3-day workshop, that these programs have spent too much time focusing on variables that don't develop personality. So, think about taking the MBTI or the Big Five inventory or the Strengths Finder, right? I mean, those are great for self-awareness, but personality tends to be pretty stable over time. So the best we can do when we focus on those kinds of variables is just work on self-awareness. We aren't necessarily, in the case of community leadership development, right? We're not necessarily developing capacity at the level we want to develop. And also, leader and leadership development historically has focused on, training all leaders on one silver bullet leadership theory, like servant leadership or transformational leadership. And unfortunately, community leadership development efforts have not been immune to some of these criticisms. And so what has been the outcome? We kind of been hitting the ball into the net. We haven't quite made the putt, right? We aren't showing effects at the level that we want to show, especially for community leadership development work. So we want to understand, knowing what's going on, not only these mega trends that are happening nationally that have local impact, but also knowing what we know about decades of research in community leadership development. We really wanted to think differently about how can we sort of blow up the model and start over. How can we do community leadership development differently so that we're making impact at the level we want to make? So our goal was to bring together diverse thoughts and opinions about community leadership development to have this really rich think tank discussion. Okay, so what made this project so fun? Not only was it just a cool idea at the start, but also how this event was facilitated ended up creating such rich dialogue and discussion, which was so fun. So how we tried to tackle this from a facilitation standpoint is we thought like, okay, let's have this sort of cyclical process. So we brought together over 100 community leaders and community development professionals. We had a day-long event. We organized them in small groups, but we thought, the process that we want to go through is we want to provide some research-based information, then have a guided reflection activity, then allow small groups to discuss, and then have this sort of rinse and repeat. So information, reflection, discussion, rinse and repeat. The other thing we wanted to be really clear about was that even though we were the staff for the event, the supporting structure for the event, the experts in the room were the people who were there. And we wanted to make sure that they understood that they are the experts. We were there to listen. One of the other really cool things about this event was that we decided, okay, with over 100 people, we cannot do death by 1,000 flip charts, right? So if all we did was capture discussion on flip charts and posted them all over the room, it was going to be way too hard to harvest knowledge in a way that could add insight over the day. So what we did was every small group had a facilitator who was trained by us to also do digital capture of discussions. So each small group discussant had a Google Doc that they were working on all day. So all the facilitation questions, all the discussion questions were on this Google Doc, and then they digitally captured the sentiments of the group on this Google Doc. Then I had 2 grad students in the back of the room who all had access to all of these Google Docs. So they were analyzing that data in real time as it was coming in. They populated a digital whiteboard throughout the day. So on 2 screens on either side of the room, there was this digital whiteboard that was projected on those screens. And then as the grad students were developing themes from each small group discussion, those themes were showing up on the digital whiteboard. So that digital whiteboard was getting more fuller, with every conversation. Then about 3/4 of the way through the Chautauqua event, I had the grad students get up and they sort of gave us a thematic analysis of the small group discussions as they progressed throughout the course of the day. So then we could harvest that insight in real time and then use it to have our final discussions around sort of how can we revolutionize our approach to community leadership development. We also made sure that people were making new friends throughout the day. So we had points where people had to find new seats in new small groups just to make sure we weren't having the same discussions with the same folks all day. Okay, so this was the whiteboard. So this was the final product of the whiteboard that was populated all day. So I'll just kind of walk you through sort of what we discussed all throughout the day. I'll just give you some high level themes that emerged from these conversations and how that led to this final discussion of, how do we revolutionize our approach to CLD, how that led to some follow-up work as well as some follow-up research. So the first thing we did was try to ascertain, like, what are some of the assets and challenges in your community to do community leadership development? What have been some of the strengths and struggles of community leadership development, as well as how should we think differently? So we started out by having participants in the Chautauqua fill out this community leadership map to identify those assets and challenges of current community leadership development efforts. We also had participants outline their own individual leadership journey to say, like, okay, from your first thoughts about leadership until who you are today as an adult community leader or community development professional, what has been your journey, so that we could expand our thinking to, okay, if we thought about community leadership development from a longitudinal perspective, from a structural perspective, we're having people think about leadership development across the lifespan. So some of the things that we learned was that certainly in thinking about what are the assets and challenges to enacting community leadership development locally was the valuable role of people in supporting community leadership success. But some of the challenges have been we keep kind of working with the same people. We need to think more broadly about how we engage more individuals, either from next generation or from those who have not historically participated in community leadership development. Then we moved on to thinking about what are the current strengths and struggles of CLD programs. We actually started by giving this presentation. I had a grad student do a deep dive on all the community leadership development programs in Nebraska, and he did a good job of sort of confirming what we had seen before, just around so much reliance on individual leader development. And then we had people reflect on, how are you seeing that locally? What are some of the strengths and struggles? And by and large, participants felt like, well, CLD programs do create a safe space to talk about some of the issues going on in the community, and that, when we do CLD, we're perhaps in a better position to serve local needs. But it's, the struggles is it's hard to find money to do this. We tend to be working with the same people. I think local program officers don't know if they're doing a good job because they're not leadership professionals. So, trying to think through how to make sure they feel qualified to do this kind of work. Okay, so then this led to, like, okay, knowing what we know about some of the assets and challenges within our own communities, thinking about some of the strengths and struggles of current CLD efforts, how should this prompt us to think differently? And so again, in doing this sort of thematic analysis across all of these small group conversations, a recurring theme that we heard was this notion of, okay, we've got to shift this mindset. We can't do community leadership development the same way we've always done it. We have to widen the pool of individuals who are engaged in community leadership effort. We also need to stop taking programs off the rack and to do CLD, but rather think about how can we create tailor-made community leadership development programs that are responsive to local needs, yet also be mindful about how we might share resources regionally to do that work. As well as, like, how can we sort of swing with a heavier bat around how we might prioritize investment of community resources in the development of future community leaders. Okay, so then we had this really fascinating dialogue, and I have to thank Mary Emery because she really gave us this line of, like, she's like, we have to make visible the invisible things that are either facilitating or hindering community leadership development. I just thought that was such a brilliant line. And so then we dedicated an entire small group discussion around this notion of making visible the invisible. So interestingly, across small groups, themes that we heard over and over were that invisible structures that facilitate CLD well is when community leadership development, CLD, when it's accessible and welcoming, and we can draw from experts in this area, draw from models. Even if we create something that's tailor-made, share resources regionally, if we can pull from statewide models, but make these CLD programs very accessible and welcoming, that tends to facilitate CLD well. Now, when in talking about what are the invisible structures that hinder the positive effects we want to see from CLD, This was so fascinating, and we're going to talk about this here in a minute. What we heard over and over throughout the day was this notion that community members associate the word leader or leadership with negative things, and a lot of people feel unqualified to lead. They also feel like they don't have the time. My buddy Andrew Hanna out of the College of Business here at the University of Nebraska, he was telling me about they're seeing this phenomenon in the management space. It's called the one more thing phenomenon right now. He was telling me that people are declining promotions at the highest level they've ever seen. And some of the hypotheses around this is this like one more thing phenomenon, like don't ask me to do one more thing. I don't have the time. I'm psychologically exhausted to take on one more thing. And so we were seeing elements of that. Like people are feeling really reluctant to step up to lead in their community because they don't associate positive things with the word leader. And they feel unqualified. And also, the other thing we heard across multiple small groups was, a lot of people feel like they're not included. And that could be because they work second shift, so they can never be available for community leadership meetings. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But this was fascinating, and again, it was it was so cool to have these grad students analyzing data in real time, so we could harvest insight across small groups as the conversation was emerging. Okay, so then we move to this notion of like, okay, who's missing from CLD? If part of thinking differently is how do we make it more accessible, make it more inclusive, who's missing currently? And it was also fascinating to hear dialogue and perspective on this and seeing themes emerge. So it was interesting, folks talked about stay-at-home moms. Teachers are not stepping up for community leadership role. Certainly like new immigrants, and this has been a pretty historical struggle in rural communities in Nebraska. But they were saying too, even farmers and ranchers are not stepping up to take on community leadership roles. Second and third shift workers, like we were talking about, are never available for community leadership meetings. And they were also seeing too lack of involvement from retiring adults, which I thought was interesting. But again, when we got into the why, it was pretty fascinating. What we heard over and over again was certainly like time and availability, which we perhaps anticipated. But small groups talked about how we don't do a good job of asking and broadcasting the ask well. But people feel underqualified and undervalued. Like there's nothing I can contribute to this, or like don't ask me to do one more thing, which I thought was fascinating. Okay, so as we were harvesting the insight throughout the course of the day, then this led to this final question of like, okay, knowing what we know and knowing what we've talked about throughout the course of the day, how do we revolutionize our approach? And we heard two major things from that discussion. One was there definitely was this refrain of we need to think about community leadership as a system, not think about developing community leadership through a program. And this is where this notion of tailor-made, not one size fits all thing kept coming up. Like we need to be able to create CLD programs, even if we're drawing from experts, statewide experts, even if we're drawing from them, we're still creating a tailor-made approach and that's hyper responsive to local needs. And they also talked about how we got to get away from event-based programming. And even if we do the events, how can we infuse mentoring and coaching interactions in between those, monthly meetings, for example? The other thing we heard loud and clear relative to this notion of thinking about community leadership as a system, not a program, is how do we develop collective capacity? So rather than having that reliance on this individual leader development, how can we build capacity of groups and teams better? The other thing we heard is that if we don't address the who's missing question, we've failed. I mean, that we heard that loud and clear. If we don't address this question, it doesn't matter. So I thought this was interesting. And this led to this really rich discussion of, okay, we have to think about the mindset people bring to the word leadership. In fact, I just did a focus group here this last week with a group of community leaders. And one guy in this focus group said, I don't even use the word leader anymore. I just ask people to engage or ask people to do a task. He's like, I don't even use the word leader anymore because people have implicit assumptions about what that means, and it's typically negative, which I thought was fascinating. And the other thing we heard loud and clear is because people have sort of negative associations with the word leadership, there's also this like automatic disqualification. Like, I can't do it. Something that we study in the leadership field is this heroic leadership bias that, for centuries, I mean, really since the beginning of time, we as a society have had this this heroic leadership bias, and that we have wanted to assume that whoever has the leader role is endowed with something that we don't have, that they're a hero. I mean, think about even to like kings and queens, right? I mean, royal houses, those are passed through lineages because of this notion of like, well, that bloodline is gifted something that I don't have. And so it's interesting how this notion of heroic leadership bias really even filters all the way down into community leadership. People assume I'm not qualified to lead. I can't do it. So that was so rich in this conversation about how we have to address the who's missing question. The other thing that we heard loud and clear was we've got to improve access. So we need to do a better job of extending in personal invitations. We need to think about when and how we do community leadership work. How can we work with local employers so that people don't feel like community leadership roles are the one more thing? And also, how do we care for needs such as childcare and meals? So this led to some calls to action. People wanted to continue this conversation through peer learning communities of practice, working across organizations, and also thinking through how can we think regionally. So being hyper responsive, but also thinking regionally about community leadership development. So this led to some peer learning dialogues, as well as some webinars. So we tried to pay particular focus to this notion of how we develop collective leadership. What are some ways we could be intentional about addressing the who's missing question, and how we can create partnerships across organizations. And since that time, we also secured a USDA grant to then like take the results of this Chautauqua as well as that pilot study to take a deep dive to study community leaderships from a systems perspective. So we just finished the quantitative phase. We've been working with an advisory council that essentially they identified communities that had a track record of success of community leadership in those like structural elements. So we identified structural elements like capacity for change, community growth mindset, civic engagement, and effective local leadership. So we had an advisory council identify communities that had a track record of success. We went through a whole like inclusion criterion process. And then we used Nebraska Rural Poll data to see, okay, do those communities indeed track differently over time on those four structural elements? Do they trend differently than their demographic and economic counterparts? So we just finished that quantitative phase, had some really fascinating results. The identified communities on trend did have a higher starting point and a better slope over time, but the results weren't statistically significant in a way where we've had good confidence in that. So now we're doing focus groups with community members from the identified communities, from the matched communities, as well as community development professionals. And we're in the middle of analyzing that data right now. So anyway, with that, I would love to open the floor for questions. Again, this was such a cool project. So if there are any questions that I can answer, or if you want to have a conversation about this program afterwards, that's fine too.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsay, for sharing that and being here today. I didn't see anything in the Q&A at this time, but if anybody has any questions they would like to, I'd say we have a small enough group, so feel free to put them in the chat as well. If you feel comfortable and you would like to open up your mic, we invite you to do that as well.
Hello.
Hey, Peggy.
Hi. In your research and talking about community leadership development in a way that is, I got on late. I was in another appointment, so I got on late, so I missed the introduction. But Leadership Genesee, we're in Genesee County in Western New York, and we're in our 25th class. Very typical community leadership program, but I would say that my mantra to the group, I have 30 people, my mantra to the group has a lot more to do with relationship building. Leadership happens anywhere. You don't have to be at the top of the rung. And, servant leadership, which we subscribe to, is really important to help grow your organizations, grow the community, get involved, blah, blah, blah. So what are some of the tools that maybe you've walked away with that maybe leadership programs could now engage with that might help move it in a better direction? Because, 25th class, and I've been here since almost day one. I don't want it to be old and old and gray and stuffy. I want it to keep being relevant to the community. I want it to always be growing.
Absolutely. And certainly what's been done historically in community leadership development hasn't been bad. It's just more like it's only been showing us effects at the individual level when
Right.
we want it to have effects at the community level. So some of the things that we've been talking about in the wake of the Chautauqua, in the wake of some of this research, is things like, okay, how can we, rather than thinking about community leadership development from like, I'm going to develop individual leaders, to think about how do we develop collective capacity. So right now, these are just some of the questions that we're wrestling with right now. So like, how might we revolutionize community leadership development to where people who are involved, we're developing the collective capacity of either that team or existing teams that they are on. So for example, how can we think about developing capacity in a collective way for all city council members? Or with this incoming class to this community leadership development program, how do we develop their team level capacity to enact community change as opposed to just individual leader development? So those have been some of the questions we've been wrestling with, number one. Number two, the other thing that we've been talking about with community development professionals who are involved with community leadership programs is designing community leadership development programs from that structural perspective. So thinking about like how do we tackle capacity for change? So in thinking about like a community readiness for change, how do we shift community mindset to be a growth mindset to where we see a positive future for our community, we see pathways for success, and thinking about how do we engage more people through civic engagement. We did a study of leadership transfer a couple of years ago. This was fascinating. We started looking at some communities that had this success in community leadership transfer. And what we learned from those interviews was that what we seemed to see was a small group of community leaders did that something spread hope. And by virtue of the spread of hope, more people thought it was the cool thing to do to get involved, which meant more people were engaged, which meant a wider pool of people to draw from community leadership. And then we tested that using roll poll data. And interestingly, while that path of like belief in community leadership predicting hope predicting civic engagement, while that model fit well, then we tested a different model where we drew a direct path from belief in community leadership to civic engagement, which ended up negative. We were shocked. So only when belief in community leadership was mediated through hope did it have a positive impact on civic engagement. So like hope became this hero variable in civic engagement that we were not anticipating. So some of the conversations we've been having with folks now is, okay, how can we think about the deliberate spread of hope in our community to widen the pool of people who are civically engaged? So if that helps at all, one, thinking about how do we develop collective capacity, but the second, how can we dedicate the work that we do in community leadership development to addressing the structural components of a community leadership fabric, as opposed to individual leaders. But Peggy, please know that like the stuff that you've been doing is awesome. And so it's not a matter of it's bad. It's more like, well, there may be some things we can add to this to enhance capacity so we get the effects at the level we want.
Oh, I don't think anything I've done is bad. I think I have a human resources background, so I've grown in this along the years, and I've come to understand that I don't have to read the 1,000 leadership books that are out there. I know what I feel inside, and I try to give that to everyone that comes through the class. And I think a lot has to do with making sure that you have a relationship with those people that have graduated.
Yes.
Because you're coaching, you're constantly coaching. And I think that hope has a lot to do with what they're going to do going forward. It's their confidence building. You're going to have some people that are going to say, "Oh, that was nice, bye."
Yeah.
Maybe in 10 years it'll come back to them and they'll use it. But I think to expect everybody's going to come out, I tell the class every year, this is not pixie dust. This isn't going to get thrown on you. You're not going to become a wonderful leader unless you work at it. It's practice. So
Yep, you're exactly right. And that was certainly when I had one of my grad students, Sean Caskey, when I had him look at the CLD programs in Nebraska, one thing that he saw over and over and over again was certainly the develop of human capital, right? Like we learn about our strengths better, we have better interpersonal skills, but also the social capital development, right? The network of those involved, how they leverage that network has certainly been key to that success. And Peggy, it looks like you're doing a really great job of like fostering that social capital development in your groups.
have you reached out to the Association of Leadership Programs yet, the ALP?
No.
Oh.
Tell me about it. Tell me.
Well, there's an association that I would say at least 700 programs belong to. I can certainly send you the information.
Yeah, absolutely. So who's the organizing mechanism for this ALP?
It's interesting that you asked that. I've kind of gotten out of it because I'm moving toward the other end of things.
Mm-hmm.
You come and then you go, but they became their own nonprofit. They used to be, well, it doesn't really matter. They've had several permutations. They were the Community Leadership Association, the CLA, and then they became the ALP. And so they're having a conference soon. They do trainings. They've put together a community leadership certification for directors. I was in the job too long to go through that. So, but I will give you the information because a lot of, especially newer directors, belong to that, and it's good for them to be able to talk to other directors and go to the conference and find out things and what am I doing? Should I do this? Should I not? How do you get this through, this topic moved forward in your class? So I'll give you that, and you certainly reach out to them. Absolutely.
I love that. Thank you, Peggy. I'm familiar with the National Clearinghouse for Leadership program, but that's typically like leadership programs in higher ed. So this is exactly the group that I want to talk with. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, I will do that. I'm sure on the email for the today's Zoom, is your email there?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Peggy. Yeah, so Allison, yes, we are writing this up. We are in the midst of it right now. So yes, we will have more to share here soon. Thank you for that. And then Sybil, thanks for your question of have you started exploring the youth parts that you touched on? Yes, and it's been a fascinating discussion. And it has also led to this, what do I want to say? What's the right word? Not stalemate, but more like we're running into challenges with this that we don't seem to have a good solution for. Okay. So another study that we did several years ago was to look at how youth leaders develop through community engagement. And so we looked at communities that had brought together youth leaders and adult leaders to execute a community development project. We learned some fascinating things through that study. One of which was that the youth who were involved in those projects, they were the biggest hope drivers. No surprise. But when the community saw them engaged in community development work alongside community leaders, the youth ended up being the biggest hope drivers. And the other thing we saw is that the youth were the most influential and the biggest resource grabbers. So point being, when they went and asked for resources from the local community foundation, or anytime they asked for money, they got it. Anytime they asked for resources, they got it. They were extremely influential. And so we've been talking about how, like, okay, we have got to make sure that this community development work is done with youth involved. Now, where we would love to do this, right now, youth are so unbelievably busy, right? From 6 a.m. until 10 p.m., they're going to weights in the morning, school all day, right? Practice, games, performances, whatever, all night. So what we've been trying to do is work with local school districts. Most school districts in Nebraska have this like 20-hour community service requirement. And so we've been trying to work with local school districts on, okay, rather than having students do one-time acts of do-gooding, a lot of one-time acts of do-gooding to get those 20 hours, what if instead they spent 20 hours working alongside adult community leaders to execute a locally identified project? That sounds lovely. Then when we try to get into the logistics of how that can work in the school day, we've been having a lot of roadblocks on how to get that figured out. So yes, we've been having that discussion. Where we've landed is this notion of like, how can we take existing high school requirements and allow students to fulfill those requirements by working alongside community leaders to do community development work? But we've had a really hard time figuring out how they can leave school during the school day to do this work, because finding that time outside of the school day has become virtually impossible. So I love that you're asking this question. If you have thoughts and ideas, let me know.
Well, it was just what you mentioned. Yeah, I remember one of my high school classes allowing me to leave. I'm also finding that not a lot of organizations want teen volunteers, nor do they have the setup to do it. And so finding those opportunities, you know, various opportunities for the teens to get involved at different types of civic engagements is hard.
Mhm.
But and I know with my girls, I've had to be very creative
Mhm.
because until they get out a little bit away from their parents and kind of see, oh, I can actually do this, they sometimes don't think they can do this. And so I found that, yeah, and then yeah, talking to the schools and you know, maybe it's I don't know. I remember I would get out of last period, but my last period was literally going and volunteering with a kindergarten class or going and volunteering with the local hospital or going and like that was on my report. Like they knew where I was going. And so it definitely has taken conversations with schools. But I'm glad that you guys are having those conversations, because then you also have to have the conversations with these entities who are like, what do you mean you want me to have a 16-year-old come and volunteer with me? And it's like,
Yeah.
no, I got so much out of it, and the opportunities I found for my kids, they've gotten a ton out of it. But I was not expecting that barrier. Our oldest is 19, and so I'm glad you guys are including them. Because there just needs to be various ways. Just like you said, community leadership looks different. It can't always be a youth council that doesn't speak to everybody in their leadership mind frame.
Yep. So Sybil, did you set that up as a work study? So when you said your last period of the day you could dedicate to this work, what was it, like a study hall or a work study? What was that period?
Yeah, so when I was in high school, it was yeah, it was a work study or a study hall. It was just if you had, like, I just had to do a contract where it said that, you know, this school knew I was coming
Mhm.
and I was working under this teacher, or this hospital knew I was coming. And then every quarter I just had to get like a signed thing of my hour sheet and brought it back to class. And it was, I don't necessarily know if it was one of my electives or volunteer or something, but it was within school because I did the same thing. I worked, I played sports, and I did school. So it was during my last period. I mean, I had to drive myself there and back.
Sure.
But yeah, it was just an agreement that, but the school made it available. Like they were like, this is the outline of what you need to do to follow this.
Okay. Okay. That's super helpful. Well, and Sybil, I'll say the other thing that we've had to work with adult community leaders, either leaders themselves or groups, community groups. The other thing that we've had to have conversations about is that we have to get away from the token youth seat. So community, when we studied how youth leaders develop through civic engagement, the communities that did not have as much success were the ones that just had the token youth seat, because essentially what happened was that 16-year-old would show up to the meetings and then say nothing and wouldn't volunteer for anything, wouldn't offer their thoughts and opinions because frankly they were too intimidated and didn't, and again felt underqualified to do this work. But the communities that had an entire group of youth working alongside community leaders, that's where we saw this sweet spot of the youth contributing well to the ideas and the development of the work, but then also they ended up being the most influential subgroup within the work. And it was fascinating. One of the communities that we studied, I will never forget this interview until the day I die. I was sitting with this gal who was a senior, and she said, she's like, before we started doing this, she's like, I could have named on one hand the number of youth or the number of high school students who said they wanted to come back to this community. And she said, now, she's like, 4 years later, she's like, I'd say about 60% of my class wants to move back after they graduate from college. I'm like, what? Oh my God. So anyway, it was fascinating to see these youth leaders when they were involved as a group with these adult community leaders, that not only were they influential in town, but they were even influential, extremely influential in their own class. Which I thought was fascinating. So Sybil, thank you so much. That really, really, really helps me, because I think that as I've had these conversations, they're like looking to me to say like, what should we do? And I'm like, I'm not sure. We got to build it into the school day. Not sure how. So that really helps me. Thank you. I will say too that if we don't have any further questions, I'm happy to give you some time back today, unless Aaron, you have other announcements. But I will say too, I'll put my email in the chat. I'll put my email in the chat. Like, email me. You can call me, so you can stop by my office is right above the dairy store at the University of Nebraska, so you can get a waffle cone while you're here if you want. So anyway, please know that you're not bothering me to reach out with other questions. Thank you so much for coming today. Such a great opportunity to share. So Aaron, thank you, and thank you to the Extension Foundation for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I'll be happy to get the recording out later this week, and hope you all have a great rest of your day. I don't think anybody argues with leaving a few minutes early, and now that you mentioned ice cream, I think that's probably what I'm going to go for with these few minutes. So everybody have a great rest of your week.